Hi folks, my name is Phil and welcome to Grounded, the series which looks at airlines of yesteryear. This episode will take a look at the unusual Denver ports of call. Established in the early 1960s, Ports of Call was a members-only travel club headquartered in Denver, Colorado. A travel club such as Ports of Call would arrange domestic and international trips for their members, with the trips being escorted by their own guides. Membership was open to the public for an annual fee, and in return members could purchase trips organised by the club. Travel clubs were increasingly popular by the mid-1960s as the US economy picked up and, as a result, families had more disposable income for things like vacations. Ports of Call needed to stand out from the competition and in 1966 saw an opportunity to acquire its own aircraft. By then, the larger US airlines had started to replace their propliners with new jet aircraft, so there was an abundance of fairly new but suddenly surplus aircraft on the market going for a fair price. Ports of Call acquired a Douglas DC-7, a four-engine propliner formerly with United Airlines, which, despite being just 8 years old, had already been deemed obsolete by its former owners. By owning and operating their own aircraft, Ports of Call had an advantage over competing travel clubs in that they had complete control over the onboard product as well as the scheduling, rather than relying on a third party's availability. Initially, the company had a rocky start, but under the leadership of husband and wife team of Larry and Freda Turrell, Ports of Call began to grow stronger than the competition, which in turn put them in a great position for expansion. Larry served as the executive director, and Freda, while being the chief stewardess, also held an air transport pilot's license and type rating to fly the company's DC-7. In fact, she had flown as co-pilot on several Ports of Call trips to the Caribbean until the bureaucrats at the CAB raised the training requirements for travel club pilots to a higher standard than a conventional airline. With the help of their single DC-7, Ports of Call grew in popularity, and by the end of the decade a decision was made to expand the aircraft fleet. 1970 would see the acquisition of 2 further DC-7s, though one was to be used for spares, and the following year another one was acquired. A single Lockheed Electra would join the fleet in 1972, bringing the operational fleet to 4 aircraft, with 3 DC-7s and the 1 Electra. The Electra was considerably faster than the DC-7, but would pale in comparison when the company moved into the jet age at the end of 1973. The Convair 990 was a 4-engine jetliner built by General Dynamics in the early 1960s. It was a stretch of the Convair 880 and was claimed to be the fastest jet transport aircraft of the time. The Convair, however, had barely a fraction of the success of the Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8s, with only 37 being built, and quickly fell out of favour with the new carriers that had actually bought some. This meant that Ports of Call were able to acquire their first one for a song, as they say down in Peckham Market. Ports of Call would operate a total of 6 Convair 990s, 4 formerly with American Airlines and 2 former Varig of Brazil machines. As Ports of Call grew, it built its own private terminal at Denver's Stapleton Airport for the exclusive use of its travelling members. Tucked away in the corner of the airport, this terminal had its own private car park, which was free for members out on Ports of Call trips. The terminal also had ramp space for free aircraft, and since it was a private terminal, passengers did not need to pass through security to reach their aircraft. It also had customs facilities for handling Ports of Call's international arrivals. These facilities were occasionally used by other airline arrivals, giving Ports of Call a little boost in cash. Ports of Call really began to prosper during the 1970s. With its private terminal and fleet of aircraft, the company really did stand out from other travel clubs. Ports of Call were helped by a lack of competition from commercial airlines. While the original Frontier Airlines, United and Continental, had a big presence at the airport alongside Western and TWA, those airlines were more focused on profitable business routes rather than leisure routes. Continental did run a daily flight to Hawaii via Los Angeles, but that was hardly competition. Ports of Call was Stapleton's biggest international carrier. In fact, while the airport had rebranded as an international airport in 1964, it wouldn't be until 1968 when they got their first international flight, the exotic destination of Calgary served by Western. While ports of call may have been the airline for international travel from Denver, these were still the days before the American skies were deregulated. Back in the days before the 1978 Airline Deregulation Act opened up the skies across the United States, there were three types of airline operation. First, there was the airline which operated scheduled flights across state lines, and thus its routes and ticket prices would be regulated by the Civil Aeronautics Board. The second were known as intrastate airlines, who were confined to operate within state lines and thus could operate without CAB oversight. These were mainly small regional airlines which, following deregulation, would expand rapidly. Some would have great success, like Southwest and Hawaiian Airlines. Others were not so fortunate. The third type was a charter operator. By not offering conventional airline service with publicly available tickets, a charter airline would be able to operate with less regulation from the Civil Aeronautics Board. Interestingly, Freddie Laker, who was considered the grandfather of low-fare transatlantic flying, used what was called advanced booking charters in order to offer flights from the UK to the USA, but that's a story for another day. While ports of call was restricted to selling tickets to its members, it was also forbidden from advertising both itself and its tours to the general public, so instead the company relied on word of mouth to help grow in membership. Members were also rewarded for sponsoring new people to join. They would receive a voucher to go towards the cost of a ticket should their friends sign up. Ports of call would also hold an open house event every 4 to 6 weeks. These would allow new members to meet and for prospective members to find out more. These would be held at the ports of call terminal, and whatever ports of call aircraft were on the ground in Denver were made available for prospective members to take a look at. When a new member joined, they would receive a badge. It would have their name on it as well as ports of call branding and Denver, for that was where the company was based. That's why the aircraft said Denver Ports of Call, or more accurately, when viewed from the starboard side, Ports of Call Denver. It's kind of like Dan Air Services, best known as Dan Air London, for that was where they were based. These badges were specially designed so that following a trip you could attach it to the badge, as a badge of honour if you will. It was possible to attach quite a few of these trip tags, though I honestly don't know how many the average folk would wear before deciding it was too many. When new trips were arranged, pamphlets would be sent out to each member to look at, and if they were interested, they could book their spot on the trip. Everything was done by mail, and places were reserved in the order that the mail arrived in. Ports of Call also had a magazine called Passport, which was posted out to members every month. It contained reviews of recent trips, previews of upcoming trips, shared interest clubs, information about ports of call, and a vacation schedule. Ports of call was technically non-profit, so any extra money after expenses would be pumped back into the company. It was down to the company's growing membership that it had found itself in a great position to expand its aircraft fleet. The Convair was a valuable aircraft to ports of call, with the fleet dispatched on trips to exotic places such as Tahiti, Easter Island, the Caribbean, and, with fuel stops en route, destinations across Europe and even as far as Luxor in Egypt. The Convair would also be used on ports of call's annual round-the-world flight. You may recall from my Western Pacific episode, coincidentally another airline based near Denver, that Western Pacific offered mystery trips. Well, ports of call did this too, but unlike Westpac 30 years later, they offered more than just the flight. Ports of call would advertise a mystery trip and only reveal the price of the trip, when it leaves, when it returns, and what to pack. These trips were immensely popular. One trip was so popular that 4 140-seat Convair 990s were used to transport the vacationers. They ended up in the Bahamas. This was in sharp contrast to their first ever mystery trip, which took place in 1967, with the destination being revealed as Santa Fe, New Mexico. Apparently, they barely filled the aircraft. The following year it was Puerto Vallarta, then Mazatlan, Guadalajara and Juarez in 1969 and 1970 respectively. On April 19, 1976, a light aircraft which had been hijacked in Grand Island, Nebraska, was flown to Denver. The hijacker, Roger Lentz, had 2 hostages, the flight school pilot and a mechanic, and demanded a jet aircraft to take him to Mexico. After the hijacker refused a United Airlines DC-8, a ports of call Convair 990 was made available. Lentz, armed with a .22 caliber revolver and a 410 gauge shotgun, boarded the aircraft with his 2 hostages. After stepping aboard, there was a very brief firefight between him and several FBI agents who were hiding on board, including one dressed as a pilot. Ports of Call Executive Director Larry Turrell would later receive a letter of thanks from Clarence M. Kelly, the director of the FBI. The dawn of the 1980s saw the DC-7 fleet whittled down to just 1 aircraft, with the propliner accompanied by the sole Electra. Both would leave by the end of 1981. The Convair fleet was still seen as the backbone of the fleet. However, the larger Boeing 707 was becoming widely available and Ports of Call just couldn't resist. Ports of Call acquired 2 ex-American Airlines Boeing 707-120s in the summer of 1980. The 100 series models were slightly larger than the Convair 990s, with a capacity of 174 seats, but otherwise were pretty much evenly matched. A single Boeing 727 trijet was acquired in July 1981. Delivered brand new to Pan Am in 1966, this aircraft would be used on flights to airports with runways too short to handle the 707 or Convairs. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 had largely passed Ports of Call unnoticed. They were more than happy to continue operating as normal. One new piece of legislation, however, was looming over the plucky travel company. New regulations regarding aircraft noise levels were on the way. Modern aircraft such as the DC-10, L-1011 TriStar, Airbus A300 and the Boeing 757 were fitted with high bypass turbofan engines. These were much quieter than the low bypass engines being used on older aircraft, including Ports of Call's 707s and Convair fleet. It was possible, however, to fit a hush kit to some of these older aircraft and therefore extend their working life. In the cases of some aircraft like the BAC 111, right up to the point where continually upgrading hush kits to keep up with the ever-changing regulations becomes impractical. Ports of Call was faced with a dilemma, however. There were no hush kits yet available for the 707, and given that only 39 Convair 990s had been built, it was extremely unlikely anyone would develop one for those. Ports of Call would phase out the Convairs by 1985 in favour of more 707s in the hope that hush kits would become available. While Ports of Call was a members-only travel club and its aircraft were supposed to be only used by members, the company had begun to operate some private charter flying. It was mostly small-time stuff, the odd flight for a college sports team for example. Then they arguably went a step too far. In 1984, a Ports of Call aircraft transported Jesse Jackson to Cuba to negotiate the release of 22 Americans after a personal invitation from Fidel Castro. The Civil Aeronautics Board were not happy and in fact tried to put Ports of Call out of business. However, a number of US district courts sided with Ports of Call and allowed them to continue to operate a limited charter operation. Though the CAB was dissolved in 1985, the bureaucracy would live on, and so Ports of Call would go on to file for a Part 121 operating certificate. This would allow the company to operate a charter business away from its members-only flying operation. By 1985, the active Ports of Call fleet stood at 12 aircraft, 1 727 and 11 707s. They were now operating a mix of 100 and 300 series 707, with the 300 having a much larger range compared to its smaller sibling. This extended range allowed Ports of Call to offer trips that were previously not practical, either due to too many fuel stops or too great of an overwater leg. Ports of Call would head out over the Pacific Ocean with a trip to Seoul in South Korea. Heading the other way across the Atlantic, the Canary Islands would be visited, with Tenerife seeing the arrival of 2 Ports of Call 707s on one trip. African safaris were on the cards now too, with Ports of Call visiting Kenya in 1984 and 1986, and of course the Round the World Tour was still a regular event. Ports of Call had visited dozens upon dozens of countries over the years, and yet only one country ever refused them landing rights. Austria, rather surprisingly, wouldn't allow Ports of Call to fly into the country. The company was undeterred, however, and arranged for the flight to land in nearby Hungary, where the passengers would be coached over the border to Vienna. Following this exceptional Hungarian hospitality, further trips to Austria would feature a few days in Budapest. Ports of Call was at a crossroads by the mid-1980s. It had retired its Convair fleet, and aside from the single 727 was operating 11 707s, which would soon be grounded once the new noise regulations came into effect. The company wasn't in a position to acquire replacement aircraft, as even a fleet of hush-kitted DC-8s would be too expensive. Ports of Call would partner with a Texan aerospace company to develop hush kits for their 707s, with Ports of Call investing around $10 million into the project. They hoped that aside from getting a huge discount on their own hush kits, that they would be able to sell them to other airlines and easily recoup their initial outlay and then some. Unfortunately for them, their aerospace partner, Texas Aviation Support, was forced into bankruptcy shortly after cashing Ports of Call's cheque, and as a result, Ports of Call was forced to write off the whole amount. The extra sting was, of course, that not only had Ports of Call just lost $10 million, but it was still no closer to sorting out the hush kit situation. Fortunately, another company was also developing its own hush kit, which would soon come to market. Ports of Call acquired 2 further 707 320s, and these would be delivered in spring 1984, having been retrofitted with these new Stage 2 compliant hush kits. Ports of Call reportedly hoped that they would be able to operate their 707 fleet into the new millennium, though they feared that the new hush kits wouldn't be approved for the 707-120 and forced leave the company with 3 aircraft stuck on the ground and only good for spares. Having lost a huge chunk of change following the collapse of Texas Aviation Support, the company made a net loss of $5 million, and Ports of Call had put itself in a somewhat precarious position. It needed its aircraft fleet. It was what made Ports of Call special, and more importantly, successful. In order to fund both the additional aircraft and the required hush kits, Ports of Call found itself forced to go public. With an initial public offering taking place in early 1986, the company was able to raise $12.9 million, very handy considering it cost $2 million per aircraft to retrofit the hush kits. The IPO didn't exactly go without a hitch, however. A legal case was brought forward by a number of concerned travel club members who wanted Ports of Call to remain a non-profit, member-owned organisation. The concern was not without merit. Ports of Call had been incredibly successful, with any profit being invested back into the organisation. As a publicly traded company, Ports of Call would have an obligation to pay dividends to its shareholders, and thus it was both feared and expected that membership fees and tour ticket prices would rise in order to generate the cash. The legal case, filed in January, was expected to go to trial in 1987. In September 1986, Ports of Call underwent some considerable restructuring. With the aviation business successfully receiving a Part 121 licence, it was decided that the company should branch out and offer more charter services, including military transport flying, once the relevant clearances were obtained, of course. With the aviation side of the company being less focused on the Ports of Call Travel Club, it was decided to rebrand the airline as Skyworld Airlines. The fleet would retain the Ports of Call livery and logo and would instead just wear the new airline titles. Skyworld soon found a lucrative source of income by placing aircraft on long-term contracts with other travel companies. The sole Boeing 727 would spend quite a lot of time operating out of Salt Lake City on behalf of Morris Travel, who were not quite ready to operate their own airline just yet. Skyworld did get some good news from the FAA towards the end of the year. The hush kit modifications for the 707-120 had been approved, meaning the airline could soon press its free birds back into service. Some other good fortune shone on the company during the year too. The original Frontier Airlines collapsed and gave Skyworld some breathing room. In the time since the Airline Deregulation Act had passed, Ports of Call had faced increasing competition from airlines no longer bound by regulated routes and fares. While Ports of Call offered a level of service arguably better than the scheduled carriers, they were struggling to match fares, and this, combined with fears over terrorism and the devaluation of the dollar, had led to a decline in overseas travel. Ports of Call Travel Club membership had dwindled too, from over 66,000 at its peak to 26,000 in 1986. Fewer members meant less money coming in via annual membership fees, so the shift to conventional charter flying was somewhat justified. According to an interview with Larry Turrell, who now held the position of CEO, the Skyworld fleet was now averaging 2 hours in the air compared to half an hour when it focused entirely on travel club flying. For any other airline operation, this would be considered laughable. However, Skyworld owned their aircraft, so they weren't paying lease fees while the birds were sat on the ramp in Denver. Unfortunately for both Skyworld and ports of call, the move to go public had left them vulnerable to a potential takeover. Kelso management acquired 59% of the voting stock in ports of call and forced through a hostile takeover of the company. With ports of call now in Kelso's control, the husband and wife team of Larry and Freda Turrell were ousted from the company that they'd devoted their lives to, and new management was brought in. Bill Boyster, a former Air Force major who had seen action in Vietnam, was appointed president to lead the company. Almost immediately he began to sell off company assets. Skyworld's sole 727 trijet was sold to Avianca, and then his attention turned to the Boeing 707 fleet. 2 707s were sold to Boeing in order to provide spare parts to the venerable KC-135 fleet, leaving Skyworld with just 9 operational aircraft. Ports of Call and Skyworld plodded on into 1988 when it was decided that Skyworld should go back to their roots and focus on operating flights on behalf of the Ports of Call Travel Club. The Skyworld name was dropped in August, with the airline returning to the well-known Denver Ports of Call name. This was short-lived, however, as the flight operations side of Ports of Call ceased operations on Tuesday the 4th of July 1989. While the airline and flight operations side of Ports of Call had ceased operating, the Travel Club continued on. Instead of using their own private aircraft fleet, Travel Club members would instead be bused from the Ports of Call terminal to the regular terminal building at Stapleton Airport, where they would then fly on a regular commercial flight. The charm was gone. Back in the day when Ports of Call was operating its own flights, passengers could relax in their private terminal and then walk out to their aircraft. They were looked after by Ports of Call crew and guides, and all of this was now gone. Worse still, the mystery had gone too. When Ports of Call did a mystery trip, they would never explicitly name where they went, even after returning home. In some cases, it was possible for folks to never know where they'd actually been. Even the Ports of Call badge of honour said mystery trip. Now, with members being forced to fly on commercial flights, the game was up, as of course they would have known exactly where they were going the moment the tickets arrived. Bill Boyster himself soon bailed out with his job done. He had closed off the aviation side of the business and sold off the remaining aircraft. Allegedly, he received a handsome bonus for his trouble. By the end of 1989, he was negotiating the sale of the Travel Club, as in the one remaining piece of the company, to Charter West Capital. After receiving his 30 pieces of silver, Boyster departed, with Dorsey R. Gardner, a Ports of Call director, taking his place. Gardner was also on the board of directors at Kelso and evidently didn't do much more than keep the chair warm. With the main selling point of the Travel Club gone, Ports of Call found itself in a death spiral as membership plummeted, with folks instead opting for the growing number of flights offered by regular airlines. Ports of Call would file for bankruptcy in 1994 and cease operations. There is a very brief epilogue to this tale, however. In 1995, Ports of Call's former director of flight operations, Bob Resling, acquired the name and branding of Ports of Call from the bankruptcy court. This new Ports of Call would go on to organise several trips across the world, with visits to Australia, Iceland, Canada, and a multi-stop trip across South America with visits to Brazil, Chile and Argentina. Despite being forced to use commercial airlines, the Travel Club had somehow managed to revive the mystery trip, with trips going ahead to Turkey and South Africa. By the year 2000, the Travel Club had around 2,000 members, and that September it would acquire Capital Air, a private charter operator based in California. Capital Air had a single BAC 111 which had been specially reconfigured with a spacious 30-seat cabin. It was hardly a suitable aircraft really. It lacked the range, capacity, and also faced the same problem that the original Ports of Call faced decades earlier, the ever-tightening noise restrictions. The new Ports of Call would operate several more trips with visits to France, Egypt, the Turks and Caicos Islands and Branson, Missouri before closing down in early 2003. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments, suggestions or criticisms, please do get in touch. If you don't have a YouTube doodah, don't worry, I've got a contact form on my website and I'm on Facebook and Twitter. I have plenty more episodes in the works, so if you haven't already, why not subscribe to catch them as they land? And as always, thanks for watching.